The tension in the international conference room was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso's transitional government, stood alone before a formidable assembly. A special panel of senior representatives from the IMF, the World Bank, and international jurists gathered to assess the legitimacy of a series of sovereignist reforms in West Africa. At the center of the panel was Kristalina Georgieva, managing director of the International Monetary Fund. As Traoré calmly and firmly defended his bill to nationalize mining resources and expel foreign military bases, something shocking happened. Georgieva, in the middle of a speech on the economic and security risks of such measures, let out a nervous chuckle before shaking her head condescendingly. President Traoré, with all due respect, she said with a smile thinly veiled in irony, these populist arguments, we've heard them time and time again. The economic data simply don't support your position. The room froze. Diplomats exchanged uncomfortable glances. Had she really dared to ridicule a head of state in the middle of an official session on his country's sovereignty? What happened next left everyone speechless. In the space of 3 minutes, Ibrahim Traoré would deliver a retort so powerful, so supported by irrefutable evidence, that Kristalina Georgieva would not only stop laughing, but would be forced to totally reassess her position in the foundations of the international economic order. This is the incredible but true story of how a young captain from Burkina Faso stood up to the most powerful woman in the financial world and won. Although Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not directly involved in the legal proceedings, he had been invited to submit an amicus brief, an observer statement designed to offer additional contextual insight to the commission. Given his role as head of state and his expertise in issues of economic sovereignty in West Africa, the lawyers for the plaintiff African states had asked him to argue the constitutional and humanitarian implications of the policies imposed by the international financial institutions. For Traoré, this appearance marked the culmination of several years' struggle to free African political and economic systems from colonial legacies and foreign tutelage. The panel's decision would not only affect Burkina Faso, but set a precedent for dozens of other nations in the South. The Great Hall of the United Nations Special Assembly was packed that morning. Pan-African leaders, economists, international lawyers, and a host of journalists had taken their places in the gallery. At the center of the panel, Kristalina Georgieva took center stage, embodying global technocratic power. Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest head of state to take part in this kind of forum, felt the weight of history on his shoulders. He knew that this committee, largely influenced by Western logic, had always been reluctant to recognize African countries' demands for autonomy. But he was ready. For weeks, he had analyzed past decisions, gathered economic data and first-hand accounts, and rehearsed his arguments with precision. He stepped up to the lectern with the calm of a seasoned military man. Madam President, honorable members of the panel, I stand before you today to outline the constitutional and human implications of economic interference in the sovereign policies of African states. For the first few minutes, his presentation was rigorous, supported by concrete figures, field studies, and legal precedents. He showed how the conditions imposed by the IMF had a disproportionate impact on rural populations, women and young people, and threatened the very stability of the state. Even the most skeptical members of the panel seemed surprised by the depth of his analysis. But when Traoré addressed the historical legacy of post-colonial economic control and dared to compare certain current practices with methods of domination from another time, Georgieva's tone changed radically. Mr. President, she interrupted him, in a voice tinged with irony, are you suggesting that IMF borrowing conditions are comparable to colonial practices? Her tone was condescending, almost mocking. Before Traoré could reply, she added, the IMF has always acted in the interests of global stability. Evidence of discriminatory intent is anecdotal at best. Then came the moment too far. As Traoré presented documents showing devastating impacts on access to healthcare, education, and the food as a result of imposed reforms, Georgieva let out a small laugh as she shook her head. Mr. Traoré, with all due respect, we've been hearing these arguments for decades. The data simply don't support your position. A murmur ran through the room. Had the head of the IMF really just laughed in the face of data on the suffering of African populations? Traoré paused. He took a deep breath, and in that moment, as he would later recount, he decided to abandon his notes and speak from the heart. Madam President, he said in a firm but poised voice, with all due respect to you and this institution, I must contradict you. What followed would become one of the most powerful exchanges in recent diplomatic history. The room hung on his words. Some panel members looked at each other, visibly uncomfortable. South American and Asian representatives nodded in silence. For Traoré, this was the moment of truth. He could have stepped back, changed the subject, played it safe. Instead, he chose to face up to the contempt he had just endured. Madam President, he continued, I can't continue without mentioning what has just happened. When presented with facts showing that millions of citizens are losing their dignity because of reforms dictated from abroad, laughter is never an appropriate response, especially not in such a prestigious forum. A stunned silence fell. Jurists murmured among themselves. He had just publicly reprimanded the head of the IMF. Georgieva's face flushed slightly. Mr. Traoré, I wasn't laughing at people suffering, she replied curtly. I was reacting to the idea that our policies could be equated with practices from another century. But Traoré didn't give in. With all due respect, madame, this distinction offers little comfort to those who no longer have access to water, healthcare, or dignified work today because of your so-called objective conditions. I was simply reacting to the comparison between our adjustment policies and historical practices of domination. Kristalina Georgieva justified herself, trying to temper the impact of her laughter. But Traoré didn't give an inch. With all due respect, Madam President, this distinction is of little importance to the populations who, at this very moment, are being deprived of their fundamental rights as a result of measures imposed from outside. And the evidence I'm about to present demonstrates why these modern restrictions must be taken as seriously as the colonial policies of the past. What could have remained a simple session tension now turned into a direct confrontation between a young African head of state and one of the most powerful figures in global economic governance. Georgieva's gaze hardened. Mr. Traoré, this committee makes its decisions on the basis of economic data and rigorous analysis, not political emotions. If you have concrete evidence rather than general assertions, we are ready to examine it. The implication was clear. She was offering him an honorable way out of retreat. But Ibrahim Traoré had not come to spare the powerful. I have precisely this type of evidence, Madam President, he replied calmly. And with the panel's permission, I'd like to present it in detail. He began to present methodically the data Georgieva had brushed aside. He showed regional statistics comparing the impact of IMF-mandated reforms on rural and urban communities. In Burkina Faso, participation in social services in rural areas had fallen by 27% after the imposed budget cuts, while in the more affluent parts of the cities, the drop was barely 3%. He then turned to the administrative purges imposed on public services in the run-up to the local elections. More than 50,000 citizens had been removed from welfare lists without clear justification. An analysis of the areas affected showed that districts with a rural or PO majority had 4.3 times more suspensions than others. At this point, an economic expert on the panel, visibly uncomfortable, interrupted. Correlation is not causation, President Traoré. Couldn't these discrepancies be explained by other factors? Traoré had anticipated this. Mr. Expert, that would be a legitimate objection if we didn't have direct evidence of intent. He pulled out a document. Here are internal emails from the Ministry of Finance, where strategies to reduce access to aid in problem areas are explicitly mentioned. Then he presented an unpublished report recently produced by the Pan-African Observatory for Economic Justice. The analysis controlled for all the variables suggested by the institutions: income, level of education, geographical accessibility. Even taking all these into account, the effects of the measures remain statistically significant at the 99% confidence level. Panel members, previously skeptical, began to listen more attentively. Even Georgieva stopped looking away. But the most tense moment had not yet arrived. As Traoré continued calmly, Georgieva came back to the point. Even if we accept your statistics, the IMF Charter does not guarantee that all policies have the same impact on all groups. States must also maintain fiscal order and prevent economic fraud. A classic argument, already used to justify earlier restrictions. But Traoré had anticipated this defense. Madam President, I have also studied this justification. He pulled out another report. This document lists all credible accusations of economic fraud in social programs in Burkina Faso over the last 20 years. The total? 14 cases, out of over 1.5 million beneficiaries. He let a heavy silence settle in. For 14 cases, are we really prepared to create systemic barriers that prevent thousands of honest citizens from accessing education, health, or food? Georgieva didn't budge. Preventing even a little fraud is essential to maintaining public confidence, she replied, rigid. It was then that the moment reached its point of extreme tension. "Madam President," said Traoré, his voice charged with restrained indignation, "it is deeply disturbing that this committee seems more concerned with hypothetical fraud than with the real and documented deprivation of fundamental rights experienced today by millions of Africans." One of the more conservative members of the panel, the representative of the European Central Bank, frowned at Traoré's words. "President Traoré, are you suggesting that this panel is indifferent to human dignity and fundamental economic rights?" The question hung in the air. The whole room held its breath. It was, without doubt, the darkest moment of the hearing for Ibrahim Traoré. He had just challenged the moral neutrality of the International Committee. He was now facing open hostility, not only from Georgieva, but from several other influential members. In the stands, Pan-African intellectuals, trade union representatives, and social justice activists looked at each other with concern. Had he gone too far? Had his direct, accusatory tone jeopardized any chance of a favorable decision? Traoré paused. He knew that his next words could decide everything. It was no longer just a question of economic arguments. He now had to defend the moral integrity of his position while continuing to respect the institutional framework. He spoke in a calm but determined tone. "Mr. Delegate, I suggest that the economic jurisprudence of recent years has too often prioritized hypothetical risks of mismanagement to the detriment of tangible evidence of deprivation of essential rights. And I sincerely believe that history will judge this prioritization severely." Then slowly he opened his briefcase and took out a leather-bound folder, thicker than the usual documents submitted to this committee. On the cover was the seal of the Centre Africain de Recherche Législative. Before this committee downplays the seriousness of modern economic policies imposed on the people, please accept the official edition of this document. On the cover was written in gold letters, "Comparative Analysis, Techniques of Economic and Social Suppression, 1890 to 2025. "Madam Chairman, distinguished members of the panel," he began, "I believe there is a fundamental misperception here. It's not a question of rhetoric or passion, but of recognizing recurring patterns, even if they present themselves today in a more sophisticated form." He opened the folder. The interior was meticulously organized, colored tabs, comparative charts, historical and contemporary examples in parallel. This first section compares colonial taxes imposed on African peoples with the economic burden of modern identification policies required to access public services. He turned a page. "Our research shows that obtaining a full ID card in Burkina Faso costs on average the equivalent of 87 in fees, travel, and lost daily wages. For a majority of citizens living from day to day, this is a real and unfair economic barrier." He continued, turning to a new section. "Just as literacy tests were once applied arbitrarily to exclude certain groups while maintaining apparent neutrality, we have documented systemic differences in the way access requirements are applied across zones." He presented several sworn testimonies from citizens living in predominantly Fulani or Mossi rural areas, who had been refused entry to social centers despite presenting valid documents, yet accepted elsewhere. "It's not about the letter of the rules," insisted Traoré. "It's about their practical application in the field." At this point, the hitherto silent Canadian representative looked up from the file. "President Traoré, this data is interesting," she said, "but how do you respond to the argument that governance procedures naturally evolve over time and that a certain degree of burden on citizens is inevitable in any system?" It was a sincere question, asked without hostility. Traoré opened a new section of the document and calmly replied, "Madam Delegate, this is a crucial question that goes to the very heart of constitutional and moral interpretation. The burden itself is not always the problem. What matters is to whom this burden is imposed and in what proportions." He presented a statistical analysis showing that 72% of the administrative and financial burden of imposed policies fell on communities representing just 27% of the national population. When a minority carries a majority of the burden, it's no longer an administrative evolution. It's a structural injustice. "The question is not whether there is a burden," Traoré resumed, responding to the Canadian delegate, "but on whom is this burden imposed and why?" He then showed a graph from the report. When 72% of the administrative weight of these economic policies falls on communities that represent only 27% of the national population, we have to ask ourselves a simple question. Is this a natural evolution of governance? Or is it the symptom of a serious structural imbalance? The room hung on his words. But the most powerful moment of his presentation had not yet arrived. Traoré turned to the final section of his dossier entitled, "Legislative Intent, Public Discourse, in the face of private communications. Throughout this dossier, international representatives have argued that these policies were put in place solely to ensure economic transparency and fiscal discipline. But the documents I'm about to present tell a very different story. He pulled out a series of documents carefully annotated, arranged by date and source. These are transcripts of meetings of the Regional Economic Commission, internal email exchanges between economic decision-makers, and private messages discovered during the second instance review procedure. He read an extract dated March 15, 2024. In it, a program manager wrote, "The great thing about these criteria is that they look neutral on paper, but we all know who won't be able to meet them." A shocked murmur spread through the room. Traoré turned to another page. And in this exchange of messages between technocrats after the abolition of subsidies on Sundays and official rights, no more distributions that day. Problem solved. He let a heavy silence hang over him. These are not interpretations. These are not hypotheses. These are irrefutable proof of the discriminatory intent behind these policies. Even Kristalina Georgieva, who had earlier laughed at the comparison between modern restrictions and colonial practices, seemed visibly troubled. "President Traoré," she said in a decidedly more sober tone, "why weren't these elements put forward in the first regional hearings?" Traoré had anticipated this question. "Madam President, some of these elements were indeed submitted before the Regional Commission, but their significance was minimized. Other pieces, in particular the private messages, were only revealed after the request for further investigation ordered by the Court of Revision." He paused. Then, looking at the entire panel, he dropped his strongest point. "But deep down, these elements have always been there for anyone willing to look reality in the face. The impact models, the near absence of real fraud, and the thousands excluded, all this has been presented time and time again. What has been missing is not the evidence, but the willingness to acknowledge what it shows." It was an extraordinary moment, a direct challenge to the world's institutional elite. Dare to go beyond technical justifications to confront a human truth. The South African representative, who had always defended social rights in these hearings, took the floor to support Traoré's point. "Madam President, panel members, what are the World Bank and IMF saying today about these exchanges between political and economic leaders, which clearly suggest a discriminatory intent behind the reforms?" The camera's gaze turned to the institutional representative. The dynamics of the hearing had shifted. The senior lawyer representing the international economic institutions slowly approached the lectern. He was visibly overwhelmed by the evidence Traoré had just presented. "Madam President," he said hesitantly, "if these documents are authentic, they in no way represent the official position of the committee." But before he could finish, Traoré interrupted him firmly without raising his voice. "But they clearly reflect the real intentions behind these policies. And according to your own legal principle, from the Washington versus Davis precedent to the Arlington Heights jurisprudence, discriminatory intent is essential to any equality analysis." Georgieva, who had begun the hearing with a wry smile, now nodded slowly, silently admitting the validity of this fundamental principle. The atmosphere in the room had changed radically. What had begun as a desperate struggle against a skeptical committee had turned into a moment of truth. Those who had been hostile were now listening, and those who already supported Traoré's position were armed with irrefutable proof. As Traoré concluded his argument, he returned to the fundamental principles at stake. The right to sovereignty, dignity, autonomy. These are not mere administrative matters. These are the very pillars of any true democracy. He stared at Kristalina Georgieva, whose initial laughter now seemed to belong to the distant past. "Madam President, you once wrote that the best way to eliminate injustice is to stop normalizing it under technocratic pretexts. With the same respect, I say this. The best way to end economic discrimination is to recognize it, even when it's disguised as structural reform or financial security." This quote, borrowed from Georgieva's own past remarks, cast a solemn silence over the room. She inclined her head gently. "Thank you, President Traoré," she said at last, this time in a calm, respectful tone. "You've just given us a lot to think about." As Traoré returned to his seat, legal experts, economists, and international observers exchanged stunned glances. In just 30 minutes, he had transformed what seemed a foretold defeat into a resounding moral victory, perhaps even a political turning point for an entire continent. In the hours following the historic hearing, the world's media rushed to analyze what they had just seen. France 24 spoke of a symbolic shift in North-South relations. TV5 Monde ran the headline, "Vérité contre puissance, l'Afrique répond enfin entendu." Truth versus power, Africa responds, finally heard. the Congolese Reverend Matthias Malou, a renowned advocate of economic justice, declared to the press, "Today we saw what happens when truth confronts power without fear. The final outcome is not yet known, but today, truth had its place." For his part, Ibrahim Traoré remained measured in his comments as he left the compound. "It's not about me, it's not a personal victory, it's a much broader question. Do our peoples deserve, yes or no, for the universal promises of dignity and self-determination to be fulfilled for all, regardless of continent, income, or language? I hope this committee will validate this fundamental principle," says Traoré calmly as he leaves the room. Behind the scenes, the impact of the hearing was even more dramatic. According to sources close to the committee, the deliberations lasted much longer than usual, with a conference lasting over 3 hours, led by Kristalina Georgieva herself, which examined in depth the evidence presented by Traoré. Usually these conferences are brief, with each member expressing his or her position and taking an initial vote. But this time, an intense debate intensified around the issue of fundamental rights in Africa. 2 weeks later, an unprecedented event occurred. The committee decided to order an in-depth evaluation of specific aspects of the economic policies imposed on Burkina Faso, a sign that at least some members were reconsidering their initial positions thanks to Traoré's arguments. 3 months after the hearing, the committee delivered its verdict in the case of the Republic of Burkina Faso against the international institutions. In a surprising 6-3 decision, with Kristalina Georgieva joining the 3 progressive panel members and African delegates, the committee rejected several key provisions of the imposed economic policies. The majority opinion, written by Georgieva herself, reflected the extent to which Traoré's intervention had influenced the reassessment of the legitimacy of these laws. She wrote, "This committee has repeatedly stressed that not every policy can be examined under a test of absolute fairness. But here we cannot ignore the substantial evidence that some of these policies were designed with the aim or had the effect of disadvantaging citizens on the basis of their origin." In a passage that particularly stunned legal observers, she added, "The committee recognizes that our understanding of economic rights must evolve to recognize that modern oppression, like discrimination, adapts to legal constraints while retaining its fundamental character. When presented with clear evidence that supposedly neutral provisions are being applied in a discriminatory manner, this committee cannot and should not turn a blind eye." The decision establishes a new framework for assessing global economic policies, requiring lower bodies to conduct rigorous investigations into the actual effects of policies and the context in which they are implemented. Judge Saudo Mayer wrote a concurring opinion that explicitly praised Traoré's evidence. Today's decision demonstrates the critical importance of presenting concrete and specific evidence of discriminatory impact for this committee to make a fair assessment of current economic laws. Legal scholars and academics began to recognize the historic importance of the ruling. Professor Richard Hazen of the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law called it the most important decision on economic rights in a generation. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard University observed that Georgieva's opinion marked a significant evolution in the understanding of global economic relations and could reshape international law for decades to come. The impact of this decision went far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Within weeks, a number of economic rights organizations filed appeals against similar laws in various countries, citing the legal precedent set by the committee. Legislatures in the countries concerned began to reconsider their approaches, and the European Parliament was affected by the decision and the powerful arguments put forward by Traoré. A bipartisan group of African parliamentarians introduced a bill entitled Universal Access to Economic Resources, which established minimum standards for economic policies, the protection of rights, and the regulation of international loans. The bill explicitly incorporated many of the principles that had been raised in Georgieva's opinion. For Traoré personally, this victory was not just a legal gain, but a turning point in his career. He went from a young military leader to a respected Pan-African leader, recognized not only in Africa, but on the world stage for his fights for economic rights and social justice. Law schools invited him to lecture on the defense of constitutional rights. In addition, human rights organizations consulted him on litigation strategy, and his colleagues, even those who didn't always agree with his political views, showed him new respect. More importantly, the International Committee's decision had a direct impact on ordinary citizens. In the next election in Burkina Faso, voter turnout rose by 18%, with particularly significant increases in previously underrepresented communities. An elderly citizen named Margaret Wilson, who had been rejected from the polls under the old rules despite 50 years of voter participation, told a local journalist, "Today I felt like a complete citizen again. I felt recognized." A year after the historic decision, Traoré gave a speech at the University of Ouagadougou, where he reflected on the profound impact of his confrontation with Kristalina Georgieva. What happened that day in that room was not just a question of economic sovereignty, although that remains fundamental, he explained to the audience. It was something even more fundamental, the courage to speak the truth in the face of power, even when that power first responds with contempt or even laughter. A student asked him if he had been intimidated in front of Kristalina Georgieva, especially after her burst of laughter during her speech. "Of course I was intimidated," replied Traoré. "The international stage is intimidating by nature, with its big conferences and formal procedures. And when the president laughs at your arguments, well, that's about as contemptuous as one can get," he continued. "But I remembered something my mother said to me when I was young and facing difficulties. She said to me, 'Traoré, your truth doesn't become any less true simply because those in power don't want to hear it.'" The audience applauds. "That's what gave me the courage to stand my ground that day. I knew the evidence was on my side. I knew that the Constitution of Africa was on my side. And most importantly, I knew that the real experiences of the citizens we represent were on our side." Another student asked what lesson future leaders should draw from his experience. "Preparation is essential," replied Traoré. "I didn't change President Georgieva's mind through eloquence or emotional appeals. I convinced her because I had gathered, analyzed, and presented the evidence thoroughly and convincingly." He paused before adding, "But there's a deeper lesson. Our legal system is designed with the idea that human institutions, even courts, can make mistakes. The adversarial process exists precisely so that all perspectives can be heard and mistakes corrected. When you truly believe in your cause and have the evidence to back it up, never be afraid to stand your ground, even in the face of the highest authorities." The confrontation between Traoré and Georgieva teaches something profoundly important about Africa and modern democracies. It works best when we have the courage to challenge authority with facts and principles, and refuse to let the powerful hide behind legal and political excuses. When truth clashes with power, it's power that eventually gives us in, even if not immediately. That's how we move our societies forward. Throughout Africa's history, progress has often depended on individuals willing to speak uncomfortable truths to those in power. From those who fought for the continent's independence, to those who defended economic justice in the face of colonial oppression, African history has always been marked by citizens who refused to accept injustice simply because it was sanctified by international agreements or foreign institutions. What makes Traoré's confrontation with Georgieva so remarkable is not simply that he challenged her, but how he challenged her. He didn't resort to personal attacks or partisan rhetoric. Instead, he presented meticulously researched evidence, basing his arguments on constitutional principles that transcend political divisions. In so doing, he demonstrated a profound respect for international institutions, while challenging one of their most fundamental assumptions about economic sovereignty and the rights of African peoples. Traoré showed that true respect for institutions sometimes requires that we challenge them to fulfill their highest mission. For the African citizens who have followed this case, the lesson is equally powerful. Democracy doesn't work automatically. It requires active participation, and sometimes the willingness to challenge powerful institutions when they deviate from their fundamental principle. The right to sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination is the foundation on which all other rights rest. When this right is compromised for some citizens, the whole democratic project is threatened. Traoré's determination to defend this right, even at the risk of professional or diplomatic consequences, reminds us of our responsibilities as citizens. As Kwame Nkrumah once observed, the long arc of the moral universe bends slowly, but it is heading toward justice. What he didn't say explicitly, but what his life showed, is that this arc doesn't bend of its own accord. It bends thanks to men and women like Traoré who reach out and pull. In this sense, Traoré's story against Georgieva is not just about a legal victory or a ruling on economic rights. It's about an ongoing process to ensure that Africa finally lives up to its promises. A process that requires courage, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to the fundamental principles of justice and sovereignty. This story is not just a legal victory, It is a call to action for all oppressed peoples to take their destiny into their own hands and to make their voices heard in forums where their rights are compromised. Traoré reminds us that Africa's future depends on the strength of its citizens, and that real victories come from those who are prepared to challenge the world's greatest powers for the future of their people. Thank you for following this incredible adventure, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about heroes standing up for the rights of citizens around the world. Click on the notification bell to never miss our videos about courageous figures fighting for justice and democracy.